Like an ephemeral dream, Klonoa came and went, streaking across the night sky, burning brightly within the hearts of those lucky enough to have experienced this masterpiece. Truly, Klonoa is one dream worth remembering. With its two-button side-scrolling gameplay, Klonoa harkens back to classic platform games at a time when the industry was laser-focused on vast 3D worlds. But if you dig a little deeper, you'll uncover a PlayStation technical tour de force that pushes visuals, audio, gameplay, and narrative to new heights. Playing as the floppy-eared Klonoa decked out in his Pac-Man embellished baseball cap, you'll explore exquisitely crafted stages viewed through dramatic camera angles while unraveling puzzles, unearthing secrets, and confronting huge bosses along the way. Every stage is paired with whimsical music produced by Namco's legendary sound team, situated alongside spectacular 60 frames per second 3D visuals. This is a case where the quality of its core mechanics mesh with its presentation to create something you won't soon forget. Unfortunately, Klonoa wasn't exactly a huge commercial success in the West, perhaps due in part to its exceptionally poor ad campaign, but it did well enough in other key regions to warrant numerous follow-ups. Namco wasn't ready to give up just yet. Thus, Klonoa quietly became Namco's new mascot for the 90s, receiving multiple new games, including a terrific sequel on the Sony PlayStation 2, various portable entries, and even a full-blown role-playing game. Now, decades removed from its original release, Klonoa has returned once more, with the Phantasy Reverie series on modern platforms, making this the ideal time to revisit Klonoa, and with any luck, convince the skeptics to give this one a shot at last. If you've ever enjoyed a side-scrolling platform game, you need to check out Klonoa. So for this episode of DF Retro, we're exploring the entirety of the Klonoa series, from its beginnings on the original PlayStation, its numerous sequels and expansions, all the way through its brand new remaster. Along the way, we'll compare and contrast the different versions against one another. If you've ever wanted to see a PlayStation 5 versus PlayStation 2 comparison, this is your video. Every single Klonoa game is here, and hopefully by the end of this episode you'll be ready to say wahoo. So, join us as we journey back through the wonderful world of Phantomile. In the late 80s, Tecmo unleashed Ninja Gaiden. Hard as nails, Ninja Gaiden captured the attention of 8-bit Nintendo fans around the world, and part of its appeal lies in its cinematic presentation. Between stages, players would experience the journey of Ryu Hayabusa as he made his way through the game. It's one of the first games of its kind to integrate such sequences directly into the gameplay. So what does this have to do with Klonoa, you ask? Well, it turns out that both Ninja Gaiden and Klonoa share the same director, one Hideo Yoshizawa, and there is a sense that Klonoa is a game designed to continue the work he started in the mid-80s in building a cinematic experience within a platformer game. It was the perfect time to do so. With the shift to 3D hardware capable of displaying 3D graphics, Yoshizawa and team were able to push this concept to the next level, both in terms of camera work, with a fully 3D camera system capable of cinematic angles and more dramatic shots, as well as in terms of storytelling. The platform in this case is none other than the Sony PlayStation. Launched in late 1994 in Japan, the PlayStation arrived not long after Yoshizawa had made the jump to Namco, where he worked first on Super Family Tennis, a 16-bit tennis game for Nintendo's Super Famicom. Namco has a surprisingly long history with tennis games. It's not something you typically associate with them, but dating back to the 80s, Namco produced a new tennis game every few years or so. And Super Family Tennis is a follow-up to Family Tennis for the Nintendo Famicom. Considering Yoshizawa's history at Tecmo, I've often mused over the learnings he took away from working on a game like Super Family Tennis. perhaps focusing exclusively on what amounts to single-screen gameplay, allowed him to rediscover gaming in its purest form. After all, before leaving Tecmo, Yoshizawa served as an executive producer and scenario designer on Radia Senki for the Nintendo Famicom, a story-driven role-playing game. Radia Senki in particular is an important project for Yoshizawa, as key concepts explored in this game would have a great influence on Klonoa itself. Certain character names and worlds created from the power of dreams served as a foundation for what was to come. By working on Radia Senki and Super Family Tennis, Yoshizawa was given the opportunity to explore both the narrative-driven world of role-playing games and the pure Twitch-driven realms of digital tennis. Prior to starting the Klonoa project, however, Yoshizawa continued to refine his craft at Namco, working on games such as Yu Yu Hakusho Tokubetsu Hen and contributing to the most excellent Wagyan Paradise, which by the way features artists that would eventually work on the Klonoa project as well. Perhaps these little guys are familiar. Around the same time, however, new possibilities had already opened up in the console space. Specifically, game consoles were now capable of displaying full 3D polygonal graphics, and the aforementioned PlayStation became the central focus of Namco's home development division. They quickly became one of Sony's strongest partners, delivering impressive conversions of popular arcade games right from the start. Ridge Racer, Tekken, Ace Combat, Smash Court Tennis, and more were immediate hits, showcasing both the power of the PlayStation hardware itself and Namco's prowess as a top-tier arcade game designer. But home consoles also afforded more diverse outlets beyond the arcade, and it's during this period that Klonoa first entered development. Alongside Namco's aforementioned arcade conversions, as well as new entries in the then newly released Tales of franchise, Yoshizawa and his team were given the opportunity to create something different. The opportunity to build an action game that takes advantage of the latest in 3D graphics technology while simultaneously restricting gameplay to the classic 2D formula, complete with streamlined 2-button controls. Furthermore, more than a decade removed from the world-famous Pac-Man, this represented an opportunity to create a new mascot for the 90s. Now, given the types of games Namco was producing during this era, a game like Klonoa might feel a little out of place, but remember, the Japanese arcade giant does have a strong history with platform games, including what I often refer to as the Land trilogy, consisting of Marvel Land, Mappy Land, and Wagyan Land. Though with 9 installments, the Wagyan Land series is kind of like 3 trilogies in one. More importantly though, there's 1983's Pac-Land. Often cited as the grandfather of the side-scrolling platform genre, Pac-Land is a game so critical to the history of the medium that, as I'm sure you've heard a million times before, Shigeru Miyamoto once suggested that it served as inspiration to the creation of Super Mario Bros. For the NES, which itself helped popularize the entire side-scrolling platform game genre that would dominate the 80s and early 90s. You see, the concept of simply scrolling the screen alongside your character changed the game. Earlier single-screen games such as Donkey Kong or Bomb Jack presented the entirety of each stage to the player, limiting the scale and scope of the challenge. Bomb Jack in particular is an interesting example, as the original arcade game received an NES sequel that shifted from single-screen action to a side-scrolling format. And this was the first credited game Yoshizawa had worked on. The key with this or any other side-scrolling game is that it expanded the scope of the world beyond a single screen. And as technology continued to evolve, developers sought to push these concepts further in new directions. 3D eventually opened the door for a completely new sort of design. Side-scrolling games expanded the world on the X and Y axis, while 3D allowed developers to expand into the Z axis as well. Now, Yoshizawa had experience in 2D game development, but this 3D technology opened new doors for him as well. You see, during development, games such as Bubsy 3D, or perhaps more importantly, Super Mario 64, arrived on the market, offering players full 3D movement. You could explore these vast 3D worlds and go anywhere you wanted. But Yoshizawa was not convinced. He instead wanted to retain tried and true side-scrolling gameplay while utilizing 3D graphics to enhance the sense of depth and place within each level. This style of game wasn't an entirely new concept, mind you. Games such as Pandemonium, also known as Magical Hoppers from Crystal Dynamics, exists, along with Sonic Team's Nights into Dreams, and Real-Time Associates' Bug had successfully played with these concepts. Well, maybe not so successfully in the case of Bug, but I digress. Each of these games exhibited one common limitation, however. They sacrificed performance in favor of creamy 3D graphics. With Klonoa though, the development team wanted to retain the full 60 frames per second of classic 8 and 16-bit platform games while still utilizing 3D graphics. A tall order for the day, but a noble pursuit all the same. The road to completion was long then. As we'd learn in an interview with OneUp.com years later, the design and themes of the game changed dramatically early in development. This stone figure at one point was intended to be the main character, complete with an entirely different set of game mechanics. But Yoshizawa wanted to avoid the darker aesthetic that had become popular during this era of gaming. Characters saw many changes during development as well. At one point, a rival for Klonoa was considered, as was a female companion, something we'd see in the second game. Not to mention completely different play mechanics, including using a chain attached to his collar as a primary attack, instead of the wind bullet. The controls evolved too, as is common in game development of course. It was at one point a 3-button game, but Yoshizawa wanted to further streamline the controls down to just 2. Several key staff members commented that development was extended beyond the typical timetables they were used to, and were relieved when the game finally crossed the finish line. That finish line arrived in late 1997 with the release of Kaze no Klonoa: Door to Phantom in Japan. The following year, Namco published Klonoa in North America, while Sony Computer Entertainment Europe took the reins on its European release. With Klonoa now on the shelves then, it's time to delve into the world of dreams. Upon arrival in North America, Klonoa was generally well received by the press. GameSpot.com awarded Klonoa a 9.2. Each of the 4 selected EGM reviewers handed it a 9.0, while GameFan gushed over the game as GameFan tended to do. It won awards and impressed just about anyone that played it, even if the sales numbers weren't exactly sky high. So let's get right into it then. What is it that makes Klonoa special enough to deserve an entire episode of DF Retro? Well, to better communicate this, I want to break it down into 4 segments. The 2-button platforming gameplay, the lush 3D graphics, the sound and music, and the narrative. These 4 elements all work in tandem to create one of the finest platform games ever made, but analyzing what makes each element unique is key to truly understanding Klonoa. So let's begin with the game design.
By the time that Klonoa arrived in 1997, it was clear that the developers at Namco understood what worked and what didn't when it came to a variety of game genres. After all, they were in the midst of an unprecedented hot streak both at home and in the arcade. And that sort of thing doesn't just happen by accident. As mentioned earlier, Namco had begun nailing down the basics of the 2D platformer genre back in 1983 with Pac-Land. This uniquely charming side-scroller continued the trend of dropping the yellow chomper into different genres, and Pac-Land was the furthest deviation yet. Although Pac-Man moves slow, Pac-Land nailed a critical element that defined the genre: the sensation of movement. Simply, the act of moving your character across the screen while leaping over obstacles felt satisfying. Klonoa was the culmination of nearly a decade and a half of refining this feeling, and it's felt from the moment he leaps from the wooden stoop in front of his house. For some people, like myself, who were still coming to grips with analog stick movement and full 3D spaces, Door to Phantom Isle's tight 2D gameplay felt like a warm respite from the uncertainty of accelerating gameplay evolution. Moving left or right across the stage, Klonoa's movements has a subtle inertia that feels nearly perfect even 25 years on. The first level teaches you the basics of movement naturally through gameplay. What is most curious is that there's some actual weight to Klonoa, the enemies, and the world that they inhabit. Yeah, he switches directions immediately and will grind to a stop the moment you take your thumb off the D-pad, but there is a sense of gravity at play here that was unique for the time. This is perhaps most apparent when you encounter a steep slope, and Klonoa will slide down at a rapid pace, but never so fast that you don't feel in control. On paper, Klonoa's 2-button control scheme felt passé in an era when games are rapidly becoming more and more complex. His entire arsenal of moves seems extremely limited at a glance. Press the X button to jump, while the square button fires the wind bullet attack. Rather than eliminating foes, this will inflate the enemies like a big old balloon that he carries above his head. From here, you can either hurl them at an enemy and watch as they explode into a cloud of confetti, or use them as a boost mid-jump, taking you to greater heights. Effectively, a double jump. This is the main gameplay hook of just about all the Klonoa games, and it is a darn good one. It's extremely simple, yet totally satisfying. Not only because of the way that it's accompanied by Klonoa's trademark Wahoo, but the way that it's gradually expanded upon throughout the run of play. Eventually, you'll be chaining together double jumps between enemies to reach new heights and cross impossibly wide gaps. Jump, grab, jump again, grab, jump again. In general, these chain jumps need to be precise, but Klonoa can use his floppy ears to hover for an extra second or so in the air by holding down the jump button at any point mid-jump. This gives you some leeway with timing, and in more cases than not, it'll save you from certain death. The deceiving part is how the aforementioned weight to Klonoa himself plays into this jumping chain. Launching a second jump from the peak of the first naturally gets you the most height, but if you grab certain enemies, such as these helicopters, during a downward trajectory, they'll be pulled down by Klonoa's weight. Sometimes you want this to happen, and sometimes you don't. So using these double jumps in tandem with Klonoa's inertia and ear flutter, and you've got yourself a tried and true recipe for something that's much deeper than it looks. You know, if any aspect of this is disappointing, it's that the true potential of this core mechanic is only fully realized in the bonus level that you unlock by collecting each of the kidnapped Phantomilians in each level. And by the time you get to that point, you've basically done everything and seen everything that the game has to offer. The final aspect of the gameplay is the subtle addition of tapping up or down on the D-pad to face towards or away from the camera. Chucking enemies into the background and foreground can reveal secrets hidden in plain sight, and truly complements the perspective that the 3D graphics allow for. It simply makes the world feel so much bigger than it first appears to be, and is one of the many aspects that set Klonoa apart from other 2.5D platformers of the time.
As Coury suggested, the shift to 3D has real gameplay implications in Klonoa, but entering the third dimension back in 1997 was perhaps driven more by the desire to dazzle audiences above all else, which brings us to our next point of discussion, the graphics. When discussing this era of 3D graphics, however, the conversation inevitably drifts into whether quote-unquote PlayStation graphics still hold up in the modern era. The answer to this question, though, is mostly subjective, but let's try to better understand what it really means in practice. When assessing the PlayStation's visual output, one must consider the diversity of its library, not just in terms of game categories, but specifically the way in which the system's hardware is utilized to display them. For example, certain games sought to utilize the full 3D potential of the system, offering players vast worlds to explore, while others opted for a more conservative, constrained approach, prioritizing performance above all else. Others still opted instead for classic 2D pixel art, or even a combination of 2D and 3D elements in a single scene. There were all sorts of approaches back then. Ironically, it's the two-dimensional pixel art games, which were considered outdated during this era, that have arguably aged most gracefully. Castlevania Symphony of the Night, with its beautifully painted backgrounds and graceful animation work, remains one of the premier examples of exquisite pixel art in all of gaming. Appreciation for such visual design has only increased in time, but the PlayStation library is primarily focused on 3D graphics as a result of market pressures at the time. This is where the issues tend to arise, however. Klonoa is, of course, a 3D game by its very nature, but Namco made some key decisions with its visual design to ensure that it remains visually appealing across the ages. Two issues which plague PlayStation's 3D graphics are a consequence of its lack of subpixel precision and its reliance on affine texture mapping. I've discussed both topics in more detail previously, but simply put, these limitations cause visible pixel snapping and texture warping. How noticeable the issues are does vary slightly based on certain development decisions, however. For instance, a game focused on full 3D exploration will expose these flaws more readily, due in part to the camera's proximity in relation to the environment. You can minimize affine texture swim by subdividing a polygon surface to use more triangles based on the camera distance, but you can't really completely eliminate it. Klonoa manages to minimize these problems through its reliance on a scripted 3D camera system that the camera concept was developed as a way to create a more dynamic cinematic experience, enabling these dramatic angles and twisting stage designs in the process, while simultaneously retaining streamlined 2D gameplay. This isn't just talk either. There's a real artistic flair visible in the game's selected camera angles. I'm not sure to what degree Yoshizawa himself was involved in framing and lighting the scenes, but I can't help but think back to the remarkably cinematic, for 1989 at least, Ninja Gaiden and its cutscenes. When comparing Klonoa against its contemporaries, there's a real sense that Namco places additional importance on the angle and positioning of the camera. Let's compare with Pandemonium/Magical Hoppers. The camera in Magical Hoppers is very active. It's constantly whipping around, often changing directions on a dime. While the gameplay is entirely two-dimensional, so you can't really get lost, it does feel jarring to play. It's a case where 3D creates the sensation of spectacle, but kind of harms the gameplay. Klonoa, in comparison, is very careful with its camera work. Here's an example. As we approach a branching path, the camera gently tilts upwards just enough to reveal the alternate route, while also ensuring that enemies necessary to get there remain visible. The designers regularly use subtle tilting and angling of the camera to clearly define the play area, ensuring that it never feels frustrating, but still looks great. And that's really important to the overall visual design of the game. I especially love the camera angles used when transitioning between different areas. Klonoa is usually offset to one side of the screen or the other, with careful attention paid to lighting and positioning. Speaking of which, dividing the rooms up into different segments has real benefits in terms of overall level design. This is an area where Magical Hoppers really falls short, as each stage is presented as a gigantic singular entity. Most of the levels end up running together as a result, whereas Klonoa is very focused like a classic 16-bit action game. So you get this glorious 3D camera in Klonoa, yet it still plays extremely well. Check out the difference here in this first stage. Klonoa is positioned to the left of the frame, while the stage is laid out before you, gently curving around the mountain, revealing the way forward. Magical Hoppers, in comparison, points the camera directly towards the player. Information about the stage ahead is kept to a bare minimum, and it stays that way up until you reach the first platform. While it seems small on paper, this sort of attention to detail is what separates Klonoa from the rest of the pack when it comes to 3D camera placement. But of course, the camera system also has numerous technical benefits as well. Firstly, by maintaining full control of the camera position, stage polygon budgets can be more easily kept in check, as world visibility is completely predictable. Only areas visible from these specific angles need to be modeled by the artists or drawn by the PlayStation. I captured this shot using the Ray 1 map viewer, by the way. It's really cool, and it lets you take a closer look at all of the maps used in Klonoa. It even reveals cool things like this. The yellow line represents the path on which the player can move Klonoa. So the other major benefit to Namco's approach here is the distance from the scene in which the camera is placed, which has the side effect of reducing unwanted visual artifacts. Affine texture warping in particular is a lot less noticeable at such a distance, aiding the illusion of a more stable 3D world. Furthermore, the artists were rather strategic with their texture usage. While many background elements do indeed feature textures, other areas rely entirely on flat shading instead, or vertex painting to add some color to the mix. Speaking of vertex painting, the art team did a remarkable job bringing this world to life through color. Take this scene. Note the green glow visible along the base of the tower here. They're basically simulating the properties of light bounce. If we disable the textures, it becomes even more obvious. It's just a simple visual trick, of course, but it's really effective and very common on the PlayStation. Coloring the vertices basically allows the artists to light a scene without sacrificing precious memory. All these decisions work in tandem to minimize the performance impact of displaying each stage while producing visually pleasing results. It's one of the most visually stable 3D PlayStation games available. Of course, another decision made in favor of faster performance centers on the entities themselves. Characters, enemies, power-ups, and more. They're all displayed using sprite objects rather than polygon models. It's one of those decisions that was no doubt made in pursuit of 60 frames per second, but even still, I think it works rather well overall, even if sprites can appear somewhat pixelated at times. Of course, it is worth mentioning that larger characters and bosses are often rendered using polygons, so it's not entirely a sprite-based game. Fun fact, if you're playing Klonoa on a PlayStation 2, you can enable smoothing to slightly improve certain scaling artifacts related to the sprites. Interpolation helps smooth out the variable distance of the sprite from the camera. Unfortunately, while it does look better in some ways, it also introduces borders along the edge of each sprite as a result of the texture filtering. Another optimization trick involves the distant background itself. Everything beyond the stage bounds are rendered using bitmapped graphics that scroll and tilt along with the 3D scenery. Certain stages even feature old school parallax scrolling with the background layer. Note how the trees all scroll at different speeds in this scene. Everything is polished off with a grab bag of visual effects, including transparent pillars of light piercing from the scene above, a fleeting rain shower in the second stage, or gleaming particles forming beneath Klonoa's every step. When you combine each of these elements, you're left with a cohesive and beautiful whole. The 3D camera system Yoshizawa and the team envisioned from the beginning is an effective design pillar that enables wildly creative level designs while retaining the all-important dual-axis gameplay. You can see this manifest right from the very start. You enter this area, for instance, from this door on the side, and are immediately presented with an upper and a lower route. Rather than trying to cram all of this within a 2D space, however, the 3D nature of Klonoa allows the designers to essentially build mini challenges that can branch off in any and all directions. It's a perfect blend of 2D and 3D. Perhaps the most critical piece of this visual puzzle is the performance. Klonoa is a rare example of a 3D platforming game that manages to run at 60 frames per second on the original PlayStation. Yes, there are other examples, such as Tomba, but it's a rare feat indeed, and Klonoa is one of the very first games to pull it off. This is important since classic 8 and 16-bit games generally also run at 60 frames per second, so if they wanted to capture that feel, they needed to hit this target. That said, returning to the game in the modern era does reveal one minor caveat. Look closely along the top of the screen and you might spot some torn frames on occasion. Yes, Klonoa drops vertical sync when the frame rate drops below its target. A small trade-off that you may not have even noticed, but it demonstrates the challenge in hitting the 60 frames per second target on a PlayStation. The key here is that Klonoa's gameplay is perfectly complemented by its visual design. The two coexist in perfect harmony. A sluggish frame rate or poorly drawn 3D graphics could have spoiled the experience, but instead we are treated with the benefits of 3D while retaining the fluidity of classic platforming games. It's marvelous. But our third design pillar is every bit as important when it comes to building a world-class platform game, and that is the audio. If there's one thing you can always count on with Namco developed games, it's the soundtrack. And the 90s were an especially good time for Namco's sound team, from the powerful electronic beats of Ridge Racer, the atmospheric tunes of Tekken 2, or the heroic melodies of Soul Edge. Namco's stable of musicians always deliver the goods, and this holds true for Klonoa as well. Nearly a dozen different people contributed to Klonoa's soundscape, yet it's a cohesive whole to the point that you'd never even guess that so many were involved. Each track is perfectly tuned to communicate the mood of the stage or sequence. What I love most about the music in Klonoa really is the journey it takes you on. What do I mean by that? Well, early stages feature upbeat tunes which perfectly suit the grassy hills and blue skies above, like this. But as you progress, the music takes a turn for the melancholy, perfectly encapsulating the struggles faced by Klonoa and Hupo. Once you pass the halfway point, however, the music adopts a darker tone entirely, more industrial, reflecting the change in scenery around you. The final acts then veer into more deeply atmospheric shades, with electronic piano notes piercing the dreamy ambiance. Yes, from beginning to end, Klonoa takes players on a musical journey that has continued to stick with me since I first played the game in the late 90s. I've always felt that the music is as central to building a great platforming game as the gameplay and visual design itself. The sound directly drives the action and injects that much needed emotional connection into the experience. From Sonic to Mario and just about anything else, music is key. But Klonoa goes one step further, with perhaps one of the most genius inclusions of the era, the Phantomilian language. So the idea of a fictional language is certainly nothing new in the realm of games. Classics such as Another World were known for injecting alien utterances into the adventure. With Klonoa, however, the development team opted to perform these lines using real voice actors. This was accomplished through building on the phonetic nature of the Japanese language. Essentially, the writers produced a script written out using phonetic sounds that the voice actors could then recite back while injecting their own performances into the recording.
Gargoyle Lefty. Boa, jerk.
Right up, get that, Daddy. Daddy? Super puppy, Pippa. Super puppy. Puppy? Puppy, Pippa. Wahoo, Hippo, Fiadu. Hippo. Daddy, we'll find the book.
Trouble. Kita even gold. Sim, kids both made. Algi the world. Who bears all income once?
It's a huge step up from something like, say, Banjo-Kazooie on Nintendo 64, which seems to use synthesized gibberish instead. Klonoa's voiced lines may not represent a real language, but they are performed as if they were, and that's the difference. There's real acting and emotion behind each and every line. An impressive feat indeed, and something that they would expand greatly upon for the sequel. Technically, however, these voiced lines are stored using a relatively low bitrate, resulting in rather muffled playback. The music, however, uses the PlayStation's XA format in comparison, which does sound excellent even now. So when considering these three elements together, the gameplay, visuals, and the audio, you have the key ingredients for building a top-tier platform game. All of the best platformers excel in these areas, and Klonoa is no exception. The final design pillar, however, is one which doesn't often factor into this genre, but serves as one of its defining features in this case. It's the narrative. As Klonoa arrived on the market, the state of gaming had shifted. Narrative-driven games such as Japanese role-playing titles had made serious headway. 1998 would see the release of seminal titles such as Xenogears and Metal Gear Solid. To that end, Klonoa, perhaps to the surprise of those that played the game, presented a similar narrative experience. Its cute exterior is a red herring, concealing its true nature beneath.
John isn't wrong in his assessment. There's a reason that the most often talked about aspect of Klonoa is its story, and how emotional it is. Nobody expected these cute little characters, who speak in a made-up language, to make you feel anything other than the joy that comes along with playing an excellent platformer. Near the end of Chapter 4, a character's death signals that things are about to get real. They don't just die, they get full-on vaporized by a laser cannon. They're dead. Dead. And they ain't coming back. It's at this moment that Klonoa's innocence is lost, and his screams of pain and anguish make you feel for him in a way that many had not really experienced outside of an RPG. In a way, the story and the way that it's told is more akin to a classic Japanese RPG. Klonoa travels across the world, meeting allies from different regions, and story beats happen throughout each chapter, not just at the start and finish. By the time that you reach the climax, you feel like you've seen every ecosystem that the world has to offer, and have gotten to know the characters who live in them. I'm reminded of the final battle in Final Fantasy IV, when all the characters that you've connected with on your journey come together in the most desperate moment to help you win. It's magical stuff. Without a doubt, one of the biggest factors aiding in the storytelling is due to the absolutely captivating FMV cutscenes. There's only 3 of them throughout the entire game: the intro, a short middle segment, and the ending. By 1997, nobody else in the video game biz could even dream of competing with the level of CG animation that Namco was consistently delivering. Just compare some CG from Tekken, which was released only 3 years before Klonoa. Sure, Squaresoft had just entered the fray, but they had some catching up yet to do. When I mention that people talk about how emotional the game is, it's almost entirely because of the ending. The ending works because of how every element comes together seamlessly. The music, the voices, and of course the main character's attachment to each other. If you didn't know it was coming, whether by word of mouth, internet forums, or YouTube videos, then chances are you're going to remember it forever. It ranks as one of my favorite endings of all time since I first played it in 1998.
When I finished Klonoa for the first time, I distinctly remember walking away with strong emotions. It's a game that tugs at your heartstrings, asking you to consider your own experiences in real life, the fleeting nature of friendship and existence as a whole. When you combine these 4 elements, then, you have Klonoa. Many of the great platformers already beautifully fuse tight gameplay with a strong presentation, but the additional narrative angle serves to strengthen the impact. While the game itself is relatively brief, it's difficult to argue that simply wanting more of a great game is actually a flaw. As such, I feel confident in declaring that Klonoa is nearly a perfect game. It accomplishes exactly what it set out to achieve with style and confidence. It's a game I've continued to enjoy throughout the years, and one that feels fresh and new each time you pick up that controller. Which begs the question then, With US retail copies of the game often fetching upwards of $500 these days, what's the best solution if you just want to replay this original version of Klonoa?
If you're looking to play the first Klonoa, then I'm sure you're well aware of the most accessible way to play it right now. However, if you have a deep desire to play the original version, then what are your options? You know, for a game that regularly fetches nearly $500 on eBay, it's surprisingly accessible via official means. Maybe it's because it's one of those games that when people play it, they have such a strong emotional connection to it that they want to have a copy of their own to treasure forever. Still, these days, $500 is a pretty steep price to pay for a single game. If you're looking to take the path of least resistance, then look no further than the PS1 Classic download on the PlayStation 3 PSN store. It's just $6, and that nets you not only the version that can be played on the PS3, but also PSP and Vita. If the quality of the recent classics released on PSN for the PlayStation 4 and 5 make you feel slightly nervous, rest assured that the emulator that Sony developed for these platforms is really, really good, offering fast loading, toggleable filtering, and of course, scaling options. And get this, if you want a PS1 accurate experience and you have a PSP with some video output cables, then you can play in native 240p when you connect to a CRT. And now for the bad news. Your window of opportunity to get this version is rapidly closing because they can only be bought by using the store apps on the PS3 and Vita. They're not accessible via the web store. The PSP store is already long gone at this point, and Sony almost closed the PSN store on PS3 and Vita in 2021 before reconsidering. A more obscure way to play the original is via the Japanese PlayStation 2 exclusive Namco 50th Anniversary NAM Collection. This compilation disc gathers 5 important PS1 releases: Ace Combat 2, Mr. Driller, Tekken, Ridge Racer, and of course, Kaze no Klonoa, and it subtly improves upon them. Klonoa has slightly improved image quality, faster loading, improved texture clarity in certain spots such as this, a slightly altered HUD, and reduced dithering make it one of, if not the best version of the original game. Except, it's only in Japanese. Although we're focusing on Klonoa here, this is a really great disc worth checking out for all the other games too. For all intents and purposes, these are original PS1 versions, with some additional PS2 horsepower to help iron out some of the quirks, like texture warping in Ridge Racer. Just look at that. All those texture warping issues are eliminated. Makes a big difference, doesn't it? There's also a 2008 mobile phone version that released in Japan that had some interesting alterations, but alas, it was never preserved. Like many games from this era, there's no way to play it today.
One thing I'd like to mention myself, in addition to Corey's suggestions, is emulation. Specifically, the results made possible when using DuckStation. This PlayStation emulator has the option to overcome most of PlayStation's hardware limitations. Texture warping can be eliminated, color depth increased, widescreen hacks are available, you can downsample from ultra high resolutions back to a PS1 appropriate pixel output, resulting in what feels like enhanced authenticity. I mean, just look at the difference here in this demo and see for yourself. It's a sight to behold, I think. And it's not just Klonoa that benefits, of course. Just about any PlayStation game sees a huge increase in visual fidelity when run through DuckStation. So how does it work then? Well, to achieve this, you boost the internal resolution here, enable the downscaling option, check all of these enhancements right here, force integer scaling, and enable widescreen if you desire. It's that simple. So yeah, this is just one more way to enjoy the original game on modern hardware. Before working on this episode of DF Retro, it had been at least 5 years since I'd replayed the original Klonoa, but revisiting the game now really demonstrates just how impactful the experience truly is and was. It's a tremendous achievement and one of the best action platform games to release on the Sony PlayStation. Speaking to you from modern times, we now know that this original game would receive a remake both in 2008 and again in 2022, and later in this video, we'll closely examine both of these versions, highlighting the differences between them. This initial game was just the beginning for the franchise, and new Klonoa games would soon begin development. Where would the series go next? Let's find out. March 1999, Bandai unleashes a new portable console, the Wonderswan. Developed in part by the late Gunpei Yokoi, architect of the Nintendo Game Boy among many other things, the Wonderswan is built on many of those same principles. Low-cost yet effective hardware capable of delivering good enough experiences while offering exceptional battery life in the process. The design taps into the colored translucent era of plastic seen in the late 90s and would receive multiple revisions over the course of its lifetime, including 2 color variants. The original Wonderswan could only support 8 shades of gray, however. While never released outside of Japan, Bandai found moderate success with the Swan in Japan, and major publishers including Namco and Squaresoft were eager to develop for the new system. Perhaps due in part to the strained relationship with Nintendo, Bandai is a major player after all, and Wonderswan offered an alternative in the handheld space, much as the Sony PlayStation did for game consoles. As a result, after completing the original Klonoa, Yoshizawa oversaw 2 teams. One would begin work on the next generation sequel to Klonoa for the yet unannounced PlayStation 2. The other would create a game for the Wonderswan. That game is Kaze no Klonoa Moonlight Museum, a spin-off that would serve as the basis for future portable entries in the series. If Klonoa 2 would go on to explore what it means to expand the Klonoa concept onto more powerful hardware, Moonlight Museum is an exercise in downsizing, finding the essence of Klonoa's gameplay and distilling it down into its most basic form. As a result, Moonlight Museum focuses more on puzzle solving than that original PlayStation game. It features 5 worlds with 6 visions each, plus EX stages waiting for you at the end of the game once you complete every mission. While not as prominent as the original, there is still a storyline here, told through these still panels presented between worlds. The premise: the moon, broken up into shards, has been divided up among artists residing within the Moonlight Museum. Each artist represents a different discipline, including a painter, a sculptor, a comic artist, and a photographer. The one weird thing about this story, however, is that it reunites Klonoa and Hupo, which suggests that it doesn't really take place within the same universe as the original game. The core mechanics, however, retain the Klonoa basics. You still have your typical moveset, including the wind bullet, the double jump, and throwing of enemies, with the only missing mechanic being the ability to toss enemies in or out of the screen. Gameplay progresses room to room with a focus on finding keys to unlock doors on your way to the end. But as a Wonderswan game, there are some curious wrinkles here. Firstly, certain stages can take advantage of the system's portrait mode, in which you can rotate the entire console, utilizing a second set of controls along the bottom, enabling vertically oriented stages, a neat twist on the formula. Secondly, the Wonderswan hardware itself is more capable than the competing Game Boy Color and Neo Geo Pocket systems. Klonoa features rich parallax scrolling, sometimes with multiple layers, sizable sprites, and beautifully detailed tile work, even if it's monochromatic. More impressively, the system updates its screen at 75 Hz rather than 60. That means Klonoa actually runs at 75 frames per second. Pretty impressive for a handheld from 1999. Unfortunately, YouTube does not support such a refresh rate, so the captured footage you're seeing here, which was captured using the Mr. Core by the way, appears less fluid than it does on real hardware. So how can you play this game today? Well, you can hunt down a Wonderswan and a copy of the game, but it'll cost you. If you're in the mood for emulation, however, there's some great news. An English language fan translation was recently released, making the game more accessible to a wider audience. Ultimately, Moonlight Museum is a neat little game that makes perfect sense as a portable experience released between the 2 mainline entries, and it serves as a strong starting point for the portable entries going forward. On March 4th, 2000, Sony unleashed PlayStation 2, and it was a smash hit from day one, becoming the best-selling game console of all time. As with the original model, Namco was there from day one, releasing the superb Ridge Racer 5 alongside the new console, with plenty more to follow. Among the games in development was a sequel to the original Klonoa Door to Phantom Mile, known as Klonoa 2 Seikai ga Nozonda Wasuremono, or as we know in the West, Lunatea's Veil. This follow-up was built on the hopes of series expansion, while simultaneously showcasing the new capabilities of PlayStation 2. Klonoa 2 would retain the silky smooth 60 frames per second update of that original game, but the developers were afforded the opportunity to increase stage complexity, flesh out the cast of characters, and integrate more ambitious sequences directly into the game. More so than the original, Klonoa 2 received an abundance of media coverage prior to release. PlayStation 2's success and the appetite for new games meant that Namco's floppy-eared mascot stood a real chance of finding a larger audience, at least that was the hope. As a fan of that original game then, I was excited to play this follow-up on PS2. I distinctly remember purchasing the game on its North American launch date of July 25th, 2001, just after catching a mid-morning showing of Final Fantasy The Spirits Within with a couple friends, a movie I'll admit I did enjoy at the time. Upon arrival at a local GameStop, I was surprised to find a queue of shoppers lined up in front of the counter. When it was finally my turn though, the sales clerk instinctively plucked a game from an adjacent container and began ringing up a fresh new copy of NCAA Football 2002 for PlayStation 2. Turns out, everyone in the line was there for the latest in digital college football simulation, not Klonoa 2. I sheepishly interrupted the clerk and asked for Klonoa 2 instead. He looked confused, then turned around and rummaged through a small box. They had 5 copies. I managed to purchase one of those copies and then left for home to begin my journey into the world of Lunatea. I was not disappointed. Klonoa 2 begins with a splash, quite literally. Following the first appearance of the Klonoa Works logo, suggesting big plans for the series perhaps, the game's first stage takes place during a fierce thunderstorm. Waves crash against the rocks below as a barrage of PlayStation 2 fueled particles pour down upon the player. As you step forward and gaze into the background, the newfound sense of scale hits you. That large statue, bathed in light from the heavens, is your goal. That's the end of the level, and you can see it right from the game's starting position. This revelation instantly communicates to the player the advantages of the new PlayStation 2, suggesting a larger adventure in weight. Klonoa 2 features more stages, new play mechanics, and some unexpected surprises, and from the start, it channels the second design pillar we discussed earlier in the video, the graphics, which is where I'd like to begin. As a then next-generation game, Klonoa 2 is awash in technology upgrades, enabling level design possibilities that simply weren't feasible in the original. The increase in world complexity combines with more dramatic camera angles to create some rather memorable sequences. It's not perfect, of course. It runs using PlayStation 2's 640x448 interlaced mode, so it does suffer from the jaggies, as they say, but if you look beyond this, it's a beautiful game. And as you dive in, gaze into the background, and you'll notice distant areas are already teeming with life, awaiting the player's inevitable arrival. Curious to see how this frame is drawn? Well, it starts with this, a single background color, which serves as the basis for the skybox, which looks like this once drawn. Now, watch as the rest of the background materializes. What you're seeing here is a sequence created using RenderDoc in combination with the emulator PCSX2. I thought it was a neat visualization that provides some insight into a single frame, at least as rasterized by PCSX2. Note how in this other scene, the ocean is drawn in these long vertical strips. The water is an interesting thing that we'll discuss shortly. Over the course of the game then, you'll find yourself exploring these luscious backgrounds from top to bottom. And one of the ways you'll be doing that stems from the refreshed roster of foes, including the Jetimo, which propels Klonoa to lofty new heights, or these cannons which can blast you across huge chasms, showcasing the background detail in the process. This newfound sense of scale made possible on PlayStation 2 really enhances the game. One of the more popular visual features prominent during this era are particles. Heck, the system even launched with Phantasy, a game based entirely around fireworks, so it should be of no surprise that Klonoa 2 leverages this as well. The rainy stage is an impressive start, but such particles appear throughout the adventure. Fireworks fill the skies of Joliant. Gently flowing particles of ash surround the ancient ark, while Mira Mira enjoys this beautiful fresh snow. The sense of motion and atmosphere made possible through the particle system really elevates the presentation, I feel. Klonoa 2 also introduces dynamic lighting. Each blast of your wind bullet triggers a brief flash of light. There's even an entire stage built around light. When you revisit the Sea of Tears, for instance, which is now bathed in darkness on the second run-through, Klonoa can capture a new entity known as a Flolo, illuminating the scene briefly in the process. It's a neat trick. And how about that water? We've got to talk about that, right? Throughout the game, you'll traverse water-filled stages with this beautiful effect, especially noticeable in the first level. But how is this achieved? Well, it turns out the water in Klonoa 2 actually relies on a video-based texture asset. VT-IPU movie files are applied and tiled across the moving water mesh, lending it an almost pixel shader-like appearance and motion. When enjoyed on a real PS2, the effect is extremely convincing, with its video-based nature only becoming evident when utilizing emulators at higher than expected resolutions. It works extremely well. The mix of expanded level geometry, particles, and lighting effects all work in tandem to lend this game an even richer appearance. And it's not just the backgrounds either. Klonoa 2 leaves the pre-rendered sprites behind in favor of fully modeled 3D everything. Klonoa and his friends are rendered using Namco's take on cel shading, a then still new technique pioneered in games such as Jet Set Radio on Sega Dreamcast. They called it the Klonoa filter. Story sequences now feature more personality as a result of the close-ups and increasingly dramatic camera angles. It's a great mechanism for telling the story, and what a story it is. For the sequel, the development team refreshed the design of the characters then. Klonoa is lankier in his real-time 3D form. I've often wondered if perhaps the decision to abandon his oversized collar from the original game was made to avoid potential clipping issues. Keep this in mind when we get to the remake, by the way. Playing Klonoa 2 through fresh eyes then, even in the face of said remake, I was surprised and delighted by how visually attractive and smooth it remains even now. It's an impressive visual feast, but there's more to this one than just the graphics.
Even with the additional graphical prowess of the PS2 behind it, the same adherence to complexity through simplicity is immediately felt in Klonoa 2. After all, there was very little reason to change what worked so well gameplay-wise from the original, and it's clear that Namco wanted to preserve this purity of design. But that doesn't mean that Klonoa hasn't evolved in key areas. The fundamentals remain predominantly the same. It's still a 2-button action game, and you'll run and double jump your way through beautifully designed stages on your way to the end. Much of the expanded gameplay comes from a wider variety of enemies, many of which have unique moves or attacks tied to them when you catch them with your wind bullet. Electrical enemies will give Klonoa a supercharged burst dash, while circular helicopters can be spun up by jamming on the X button, allowing for controlled flight. Many of the one-off gameplay scenarios from Door to Phantom Isle make a return and are expanded upon. Levels that switch between 2 distinct modes mimic the light and dark chapter from the original. You'll also be manipulating ticking time bombs next to switches fairly often. In general, there's a tendency to lean heavier on puzzles overall, but it's integrated into the flow of the levels more efficiently. The increased level size allows the designers to play with new level concepts too. Specifically, the addition of the hoverboard used at several key points throughout the game. Klonoa 2 remains primarily a side-scrolling platformer, but these sections tend to integrate 3D platforming into the mix and give the player a taste of a wider range of movement. Yeah, it's still technically on rails, but you'll find yourself launching over obstacles or narrowly avoiding bottomless pits. It adds a lot of variety to the experience. Klonoa 2 also introduces players to a Super Mario-style world map after completing the opening stage. While it contains comparatively fewer stages compared to the Plumber's Adventures, each stage is sizable and unique. The game is broken up to 5 kingdoms, with each kingdom offering its own themed levels. While it's true that you'll revisit key stages along the way to the end, even these mix things up with new wrinkles the second time through, such as a fast-paced chase sequence through the war-torn Volk City. The addition of an action button mapped to L1 and L2 caused Klonoa to strike a cool pose, and is largely inconsequential. The developers claim that this was to make the player feel like they were inhabiting the role of Klonoa more, but that's kind of a stretch if you ask me. Most will just think it's fun to see him pull some rad moves while snowboarding.
Coury isn't wrong on that. I know I can't get enough of Klonoa's radical moves. Heck, several key boss fights are also built around the snowboarding mechanics, resulting in greater variety when it comes to stomping out the big bads. But it's not just those mechanics that make the boss fights so interesting. Sure, you still have your donut-style encounters like the original game, but other battles take full advantage of new traversal options. I especially love the integration of bounce pads into a key boss battle. Launching high into the air from a bounce pad as the camera tilts down just in time to deliver a direct hit feels amazing. Really, Klonoa 2 is just a masterclass in controlled spectacle. The game is responsive and tightly paced, yet there's this real sense of performative energy pulsing through its design. Everything just feels delightfully exaggerated in pursuit of fun. But of course, nothing enhances the platforming experience quite like a catchy soundtrack. As mentioned earlier in this video, Namco had established itself as a major player in the video game music scene, and by 2001, things were better than ever. Following the release of the original Klonoa game, Namco published stone-cold classics such as Ridge Racer Type 4 with its smooth soundtrack. Mr. Driller, and of course, Tekken Tag Tournament, among many others. For Klonoa 2, given the superlative quality of the original game's score, expectations were high. Veteran composers were joined by fresh recruits to create a brand new score for this adventure, and the result is expectedly superb. The soundtrack features a wide variety of music, ranging from dreamy, optimistic melodies such as this, to bouncy tracks like this, more atmospheric pieces, and it even goes into the realm of unsettling. We'll discuss this particular track later, as it's important to the game's story, but the point is now, Klonoa 2's soundtrack is as vast and memorable as one could hope. It lives up to that original game in every way. Even better, the developers implemented a music system that allows the game to fade between two different versions of the same track depending on whether you're indoors or outdoors. Take a listen. But there's an interesting technical wrinkle I wanted to mention here. Klonoa 2 supports Dolby Digital 5.1 playback in select sequences. Now remember, the PlayStation 2 does not support real-time interactive Dolby Digital decoding, as was possible on the Xbox, but using the optical output of the console, it can play back Dolby 5.1 soundtracks. This is something necessary for DVD movies, and it's basically how the team used it for Klonoa 2. They have a pre-recorded audio sequence that plays during the real-time graphics rendering for specific cutscenes. Then you have the voice acting. This time, voice quality is improved. While only stored at 22 kHz, the actual playback is a lot cleaner than the highly muffled original.
ランダルプヴィラマワフクララルーテリメットリングマニドゥレリア
Alda Lutu Nidu? Ishniant.
There are also more spoken lines throughout the game, and perhaps most interestingly, the Mountains of Mira Mira stage features a vocal track performed using the fictional language. But of course, the voice acting plays an important role when it comes to establishing the narrative, which is something we should discuss right now.
After the emotional impact of the original game's ending, the development team was put in a difficult spot. You can't just take that same approach a second time and expect similar reactions. To that end, Klonoa 2 presents a different sort of tale, one in which Klonoa is now more aware of his unique place as the Dream Traveler. Overall, the story is quite a bit more mature than the original. What begins as a quest to obtain 4 elements while trading blows with the sky pirate Liarina and her companion Tat, the story takes a darker turn late in the game. This time around, cutscenes are rendered in-engine. While I lamented the loss of the full-motion video cutscenes featured in the original, it makes sense given the change from pre-rendered character sprites to the cel-shaded ones in Lunatea's Veil. CG animation would seem at odds with the look and style of the rest of the game, but at times it is sorely missed. By the time you reach the climax, it really becomes apparent that this is a more grown-up and experienced Klonoa. He knows what's going to happen, and has more or less accepted that he is doomed to a Sam Beckett-like experience, where he leaps from world to world, forges relationships, solves their problems, and then has to leave, never to see his friends again. Or at least that's what Namco would have you believe.
One key aspect of the narrative I'd like to touch on myself, though, involves the game's final stages and the deeper meaning hidden within. Be warned though, there are spoilers and speculation coming up. As Klonoa floats through the void during the game's introduction, he hears a call for help from a mysterious voice just before arriving in Lunatea. You're quickly distracted by your new friends and a quest for the 4 elements, but this mysterious voice is heard at various points throughout the story. This turns out to be the King of Sorrow, the ruler of the 5th Kingdom Diodina sought to raise from its ashes in order to plunge the rest of the world into sorrow. But it's not that simple. Klonoa 2's storyline is surprisingly ambiguous. What is the purpose of Klonoa in this world? What do these characters represent? Who even is the King of Sorrow? Fans have discussed all of this over the years, but there's one key moment that really sticks out to me. It's the arrival in the Kingdom of Sorrow. As one of the game's final stages, the Kingdom of Sorrow represents a fierce challenge for players, not only gameplay-wise, but in its deeper meaning. Remember that track I played earlier? Listen closely. Does that sound familiar? Well, listen again. Yes, buried within the distorted notes, you'll hear remnants of music from the original Klonoa, Door to Phantom Mile. This is the track played during the final moments with Klonoa's grandfather in the original game, or at least that's what he believed when he experienced this traumatic moment. I mention this because during other cutscenes in the original game, Grandpa can be seen resting in his rocking chair. These sequences share the same theme, by the way, just faster. But gaze into the background in the Kingdom of Sorrow, and you might notice abandoned rocking chairs scattered all across the stage. Getting the picture now? There's a sense that this stage might actually represent something akin to repressed memories of an imaginary life in Phantom Isle. It's as if we're seeing the distorted echoes of Klonoa's memories visualized within this new game world. And the actual name of the Kingdom of Sorrow is Huponia, similar to the friend Hupo he left behind in that first game. There's also visual similarities between Huponia and Vision 6-2 from the original game as well. Only now it stands as a distorted skeleton of a past that only exists as a memory. And when you finally encounter the King of Sorrow himself, there's this sense that he's something else entirely. I don't want to go too far down this hole of speculation, but many of the design choices feel very deliberate. The symbolism on display left a strong impact on me as I completed the game, and that's not even getting into other characters such as Lolo. As you play through the game, try to keep this in mind and perhaps you'll feel it too. But okay, let's say you want to play this version of Klonoa 2 today. What are your options? Well, unfortunately, Klonoa 2 was less widely available than the original game, and if you wanted an official copy of it, your only option was to hunt down a disc. It was never sold as a PS2 classic for PlayStation 3 owners, and the unofficial repackagings of the game into the PS2 classics format exhibit glitches and crashing later in the game. There is one unofficial option, however, PCSX2. While older builds struggled to emulate this game properly, the most up-to-date builds of PCSX2 offer a generally good emulated experience. It's not glitch-free, but it's very playable and allows for higher resolution rendering, and it's a very decent way to enjoy it. Alas, aside from these solutions, Klonoa 2 has been relatively inaccessible for years, but thankfully that all changed with the arrival of the Phantasy Reverie series, which is something we'll discuss shortly. Revisiting Klonoa 2, however, has cemented my feeling that this is a very special game indeed. Fans of the series often point to the original as the superior game, but Klonoa 2 is every bit its equal in my book. The stage design is just exceptionally well done, with a perfectly balanced difficulty curve that ramps up smoothly right up until the end. The presentation, the new gameplay elements, and the storytelling, everything is top tier. Alas, Klonoa 2 is the final mainline entry in the series, and by the end of 2002, Klonoa would go dormant for years. Before we reach that point, however, Namco would release 4 additional Klonoa games, including a brand new game on the original PlayStation, which is perhaps not exactly what you might expect. Following the release of Klonoa 2, Namco's floppy-eared hero would make his return to the world of portable gaming. But before we talk about his adventures on Game Boy Advance, I want to talk about another game, Klonoa Beach Volleyball. Released in Japan on April 25th, 2002, and later in Europe, Klonoa Beach Volleyball is an exceptionally late release for the Sony PlayStation, arriving more than 2 years after the PlayStation 2. The game kicks off with the Klonoa Works banner, and yeah, cross-checking the game's credits, you'll find a lot of familiar staff are involved in the creation of beach volleyball. In a sense, the simple arcade action in beach volleyball almost feels like a nod to Namco's past. Remember Super Family Tennis or the Smash Court series? It feels a lot like a natural extension of those games. And yeah, Klonoa Beach Volleyball is an arcade-style volleyball game, featuring the cast from the first 2 Klonoa games. Like Namco's tennis titles, Klonoa Beach Volleyball is rather light on features. You have a championship mode, which basically serves as its arcade mode, allowing you to select a team and then play through a series of matches until the end, as well as an exhibition mode, which gives you free reign over the game's available options. If you fancy a game of multiplayer, it even supports the PlayStation 1 multi-tap, enabling 4 players simultaneous play. Mechanically, it's very simple, but it feels remarkably satisfying to play. Your main actions are executed using X and square, but you also have a taunt button and, of course, a super move. One curious change with beach volleyball, the fictional language featured in prior games is completely replaced with proper recorded lines. In the Japanese version of the game, that means they speak Japanese, while the PAL version received an English localization that's surprisingly not half bad. Visually, it's a rather attractive PlayStation game too. The game's tech director also served this role on Klonoa 2, so you know it's in good hands, and yeah, as a late generation Namco game, it holds up very well. This time, the characters are rendered in full 3D, with geometrically simple but stylishly designed models that are very expressive and well animated, though perhaps a little bit too Rayman at times, if you catch my drift. The shift to 3D, however, comes at a cost, as the frame rate is now reduced to just 30 frames per second, making this the only Klonoa game falling short of at least 60 frames per second. Ultimately, beach volleyball is kind of a puzzling game. On one hand, expanding into the world of volleyball is a fun idea and not necessarily unusual for mascot characters, plus Namco has years of experience in creating arcade games like this. Yet at the same time, the choice of platform is baffling. Why develop this for the original PlayStation? It feels like any chances of success were instantly limited by this decision. I'm sure Namco opted to skip the game for North American release for this very reason. Still, if you're a diehard Klonoa fan, it's certainly worth a look. But now, let's rewind back to the summer of 2001 as Klonoa returns to the world of handhelds. Beginning in July of 2001 and ending the following December, Klonoa would receive 3 new games for Nintendo's then new Game Boy Advance, its next-generation portable. The first of these 3 arrived on July 19th in Japan and regrettably September 11th, 2001 in the US. Known in the West as Klonoa Empire of Dreams, this new game serves as both a follow-up and pseudo-remake of the Wonderswan game, only this time in full color, and with plenty of new features in tow. It was developed through a partnership with Now Production, or NowPro, a development company Namco had been working with for more than a decade at this point. They even helped create the earlier Wagyan Land games that I mentioned. The story presentation has been significantly improved over Moonlight Museum, with more artwork and a clever reliance on sprite scaling to communicate the story beats. Yoshizawa himself was even involved in the creation of this storyline, which focuses on an insomnia-stricken king who has forbidden his subjects from dreaming, declaring it illegal. Klonoa is arrested for this crime, but eventually given the chance to repent by defeating 4 beasts occupying nearby lands. In the end, it's not a bad little story, but the existence of Hupo within this world sort of negates the mainline console games. Thus, it's not really clear when, where, or how the story could even occur. But once you actually dive into the game, there's plenty of meat to sink your teeth into. Empire of Dreams features 5 worlds, each with 7 visions, and a boss battle, plus a new set of challenging EX levels. Unlike the Wonderswan game, however, these visions are presented via a beautiful world map system, complete with this nifty scaling feature, used as you select each level. The stages here feature more variety this time around. You'll spend most of your time collecting stars in order to unlock the stage exit, exactly like the Wonderswan game. And the challenge here stems from puzzling your way through each level in pursuit of these star fragments. This time, however, new stage types have been introduced to the mix. The first focuses on hoverboarding, similar to Klonoa 2, only viewed from the side. Klonoa 2 was in development during the same time, so it kinda makes sense, and in this game, the stages feature auto-scrolling, asking the player to dodge foes and pits while collecting dreamstones. They're a lot of fun and add some nice variety to the game that was sorely lacking in the Wonderswan outing. The second type then is also auto-scrolling, but it focuses more on precision platforming. and these are also a great time. Of course, one of the larger additions is the inclusion of proper boss battles, asking the player to take down foes between each world. These battles are rather nifty though, as they feature scaling and rotation features, allowing the camera to zoom in and out like an old Neo Geo game as bosses spin around the arena effortlessly. It's a great way to showcase what the GBA is capable of. And it's also interesting to see the ways in which Moonlight Museum factors into this new game. Empire of Dream's first level, for instance, basically reuses the same design that was already featured in Moonlight Museum, with most of the differences stemming from tweaks to object placement and of course the new tile sets. There is a lot of brand new content in the GBA game of course, but it's interesting to see how many of the stages from Moonlight Museum were repurposed for this game, which kind of makes sense given the more limited audience. Unfortunately, this also highlights one of my complaints with the GBA game: the background design. What do I mean? Well, check it out. So on GBA, the main background layer is basically just an image that remains fixed in place. It never scrolls with the rest of the screen. Instead, a second background layer, which is relatively simple by the way, does scroll and is placed directly in front of this first static layer. It appears somewhat disconnected as a result. Over on Wonderswan, however, note how the background functions in a way more typical of classic parallax scrolling. The main layer scrolls alongside the foreground but at a reduced speed to enhance the parallax effect. The clouds then scroll at their own speed, lending further to the depth of the environment. The point is, I don't really like the static backdrops in GBA and feel that it kinda cheapens the presentation despite the addition of color. This is furthered by the new world tiles, which feel exceptionally blocky, almost akin to a Lego set. Every stage is fully boxed in too, without the open sky areas that were used in certain stages on Wonderswan, and the different tiles really feel disconnected here. It's almost like in an effort to expand the tile set, the developers failed to create transitional tiles to connect the world together, so you have things like a wooden platform set floating directly next to a rock formation, or something else like that. Neither of these are really connected. But when you look at the Wonderswan game, even though it's lacking in variety, its world construction feels a lot more refined, as individual tiles more elegantly connect to one another. It becomes even more evident while exploring these interior sections. On Wonderswan, there are a layer of tiles behind Klonoa that act as the supporting structure for the level, and you can still see the parallax background behind this. On GBA, everything just sort of floats in midair with no rhyme or reason. Hopefully you get the rough idea of what I'm saying, but while I think it looks nice enough on GBA, it doesn't quite hit the mark for me visually. That being said, the actual sprite work is significantly better on Game Boy Advance, with many more frames of animation and scaling effects to simulate squash and stretch. Like here, if you hold an enemy and jump into the bottom of a platform, you'll see him squish, just like the console game. But on Wonderswan, that doesn't happen at all. So while I do have nitpicks with the visuals, it's still a nice looking game overall, I'd say. Audio-wise, it is however a step up from the Wonderswan game, which had very few tracks and what was there was extremely simplistic. Though in this case it uses a mix of samples with the Game Boy sound chip, producing a sort of hybrid sound that would become somewhat common on the platform. The good part here is that it doesn't have the ultra scratchy sound of many Game Boy Advance games. Now, 1 year later, Namco and NowPro followed this up with Kaze no Klonoa G2, Dream Champ Tournament, at least in Japan that is. You see, despite its 2002 release date, the North American version didn't even arrive until 3 years later in 2005, and it never appeared in European countries either. Furthermore, Yoshizawa was not involved in the production of this follow-up, further distancing itself from the main series. Despite this, Klonoa G2 is very much a direct continuation of the prior portable entries. It uses the same core technology and exhibits all of the same visual design choices, including the rather lackluster parallax scrolling. There are some changes, yes, but if you've played Empire of Dreams, you know exactly what to expect here. So what is new, you ask? Well, G2 features the inclusion of these new underwater sections, which have Klonoa navigating the world in a submarine. While it can be a little frustrating at times, it does add some much needed variety to the mix. Secondly, and more successfully I'd say, they've introduced a new pseudo 3D hoverboard stage that has Klonoa gliding into the screen while dodging obstacles along the way. It uses GBA's sprite scaling capabilities as well, and it looks awesome in motion. This is still very much a continuation of the last two portable games, however, and all three form a trilogy of sorts. This style of slower paced, puzzle driven Klonoa gameplay is a lot of fun though, and some people even prefer these over the console games, but for my money, the two mainline entries are still a lot more enjoyable. But if you're hankering for more Klonoa and you've not played them, it's definitely worth a shot, and you can still get them on the Wii U's Virtual Console. Then, in December 2002, Namco unleashed one final entry on Nintendo's Game Boy Advance with Klonoa Heroes Densetsu no Star Medal, Klonoa's first role-playing game. Yep, Heroes is, at its core, a multi-character action RPG. The story is told through these small animated portraits that bounce and scale around the screen, effectively communicating the intended mood. You'll travel from vision to vision, much like the more traditional Klonoa titles, but this time, the action takes place from above. Using this overhead perspective, Klonoa and friends will explore these mini dungeons, amassing treasure, useful items, and taking out foes along the way. Visually, Heroes is a curious one. The sprites are big, bold, and super well animated, and the backgrounds are very detailed, with buttery smooth scrolling and some nice effects like this reflective water. But at the same time, the backgrounds are also somewhat repetitive, and a large chunk of the screen real estate is sacrificed in favor of this giant information panel. The gameplay window shares more in common with an original Game Boy game than a GBA one. At least you can customize the info panel to your liking with different available color schemes. Now, over the course of the game, you'll spend most of your time switching between the three main characters while unleashing their different attacks. There are gameplay sections which involve using vehicles, however, such as a submarine, which does add some variety, but by and large, the game is a little on the repetitive side. Each vision is broken up into different chunks, and between these different areas, you'll have access to a menu allowing you to save your game, use items, or change equipment. The level design is not randomized, thankfully, but it definitely feels like a dungeon crawler when you get right down to it. Audio-wise, Heroes mostly follows in the footsteps of the prior GBA Klonoa titles through a combination of samples and chiptunes. A fully sample-based soundtrack would have likely required additional cartridge space, which was perhaps not included in the game's budget. They did, however, produce a vocal theme specifically for Klonoa Heroes, but unlike Stepping Wind in Klonoa 2, this one is done in Japanese. It is, however, sung by the same voice actress, Kumiko Watanabe, who voices Klonoa throughout the series. For a GBA game, it's not half bad. Ultimately, Klonoa Heroes is a breezy little action RPG. It gets repetitive, but it works better than you might expect, though at the same time it does feel strange that the final original Klonoa game is Klonoa Heroes, given how far it strays from the mainline series. I wonder what Namco intended with this game. If you've always wanted to play Klonoa Heroes then, but aren't proficient in Japanese, there's good news. A fan translation exists, allowing you to enjoy the game in English if you so desire. And for many Klonoa fans, this might just be the missing shard from your memories of the series as a whole, so give it a shot. After the release of Klonoa Heroes, however, Namco closed the book on our little hero for the time being, at least when it comes to starring in his own games.
Despite all of his ups and downs over the years, Klonoa has remained one of Namco's favorite characters in-house. He's been referenced or has cameoed in a ton of different games since his introduction in 1997. Let's see how many we can find. Not long after the first Klonoa's release, Namco decided to use some of the clout that Ridge Racer had with PlayStation fans by putting a track called Phantomile in Ridge Racer Type 4 on the PS1. Although Klonoa doesn't appear in the game himself. I guess he just wasn't old enough to drive yet. The track is adorned with billboards for the game, appearing next to giant balloons of Namco's most well-known characters, Pac-Man and Dig Dug. By the year 2000, Namco ramped up the Big K's appearances significantly in preparation for the fast-approaching Klonoa 2. Though he still has some unfinished business on the original PlayStation. Klonoa's head is one of many different Namco characters portrayed during the Shoot the Sample game in Point Blank 3. He was also an unlockable character in the PS1 tennis game Smash Court 3, if you were able to get an A rank in Expert mode. In the arcade, the little guy was a member of the Namco 90s All-Star team in the Sega Naomi hardware-based soccer game World Kicks. On the PlayStation 2, you could take control of Klonoa, complete with his Lunatea's Veil hoverboard in the Japan and Europe exclusive Alpine Racer 3. Not only is he the best character in the game, but the announcer has a variety of introductions for him.
Give it up for the floppiest ears in town. Here's Klonoa, the Master Dream Traveler.
MotoGP on the PS2 gave Klonoa his highest profile side gig yet, appearing as an oversized and, let's face it, hilarious playable character. Mounted up on his baby blue beach cruiser style bike, seeing Klonoa on the racetrack ranks as almost as funny as a PC filled with beans. Series-related characters, locations, and themes are unlockable in Namco's Family Tennis on the Game Boy Advance, Family Stadium 2003 on the GameCube, and even Pro Baseball Femista 2011 on the 3DS. Then, there's Namco Cross Capcom, a cool Japanese exclusive strategy game for the PS2 that throws a ton of characters from both companies into a ridiculous story. Klonoa and Gantz from Klonoa Heroes appear pretty early on in this story. Klonoa speaks in full Japanese this time around, which is an understandable, if disappointing, change. This was one of those games that I just couldn't believe didn't get localized back in 2005, but at least a fan translation makes it playable for English speakers today. The follow-ups, Project X Zone and Project X Zone 2 on the 3DS, were localized for English-speaking audiences, but unfortunately, Klonoa doesn't appear in either of these games for whatever reason. For about the last decade, Klonoa's main appearances have been little references and inconsequential DLC items, like this hat, a statue, I don't know, whatever it is, DLC in Soul Calibur 5. I bought the DLC pack with this thing in it for 99 cents, just so I could show you my hastily created custom character wearing it in this video. Outside of minor appearances like those, Namco made the disappointing call to put full-fledged Klonoa games on an extended hiatus for the foreseeable future. That is, until a certain Nintendo console seemed like the perfect place to stage a revival and bring the character back to the forefront.
Launched in late 2006, Nintendo surprised everyone with the success of its new Wii console. With the Wii, Nintendo dropped out of the tech race, aiming instead to deliver new ways to play, as opposed to focusing on high-definition graphics, and it paid off big time. But it wasn't just about motion control. You see, Nintendo also helped kickstart a newfound appreciation for classic gaming, thanks in part to the launch of Virtual Console, a service which made classic Nintendo games available to Wii owners for a low price. It was a huge success, and I'd argue this resurgence of classic 2D gamings made remakes and re-releases more viable as well. And as a result, the 2D platformer kinda sorta returned to prominence, at least for a while. We received 2 brand new Mega Man games created in the style of the NES originals, a gorgeous remake of Bionic Commando from Capcom. Nintendo created a brand new 2D Mario game, while both Kirby and Donkey Kong returned to the respective worlds in full 2.5D glory. And then there was Klonoa. Released in 2008, Klonoa is a complete remake of Door to Phantomile from the PlayStation, developed exclusively for Nintendo Wii. Japanese web surfers circa 2008 were treated to a mini-game in the lead-up to release on the official Klonoa homepage called Moo Attack. In this puzzle game, players are tasked with hoarding Klonoa's Dreamstones by preventing Moos from snatching them. You run back and forth, using your wind bullet to snap up Moos and fling them back into the crowd strategically. It's not a bad little game, and I suppose that it could be argued that this, rather than Klonoa Heroes, is the last actual original Klonoa game. Namco didn't forget about its American customers though. Early copies of Klonoa include a voucher for a free taco from Wahoo Tacos. Created primarily by a new team with involvement from Yoshizawa and other veterans, Klonoa for Wii was designed to reintroduce the series to new players. It uses an entirely new graphics engine, taking advantage of the Wii's hardware. It supports 480p and widescreen, features full 3D character models as opposed to sprites, and includes newly recorded voice acting. And that includes both the fictional Phantomelian language and 2 human languages in the form of Japanese or English, depending on the region. I'm thankful that the Phantomelian language option was retained though, as the English dub is interesting to say the least. Take a listen.
I wonder if Gaudius and Joker are involved. Well, we can't go any further here. Do you want to try going to Jugpot?
Sure, let's go.
My mom is in the castle, and there's something wrong with her. Could you please save her? She's probably been brainwashed or something.
Okay, we'll see what we can do.
Okay, so it's not actually that bad, but it is a little weird hearing these same voices used for the voice clips played during gameplay.
Wahoo!
When using the Phantomile option, however, the voices have been re-recorded for the Wii version and the script somewhat rewritten. The actual bitrate of the voice files is also much higher than the original game.
You jerk. Thank you.
乗るもん
Hot. Boa. Levy blood bleeder.
Ijo. Very good.
I do.
トフィキュポピ
The core gameplay and story beats have all been successfully retained for this version. It plays just as well as the original and feels great. In bringing it to the Wii, however, the development team instituted a number of key changes. Firstly, Klonoa's character was redesigned once more. He's now lankier, more in line with Klonoa 2, and he lacks the oversized collar of that original design. At one point, a North American specific redesign was even considered, but thankfully, cooler heads prevailed. The Wii version does include a costume selection option. If you prefer his outfit from Klonoa 2, for example, you can use it. And that's just scratching the surface of the options available in this version. There's a reverse mode that lets you play mirrored versions of every stage in the game, and a bunch of other bonus features as well, so it is fully packed. While the level design has received some tweaks and changes, this is fundamentally Door to Phantom rebuilt for the Wii. But until now, I've never really sat down to examine the two side by side, so let's dive into some direct comparisons, shall we? So the first major difference you might notice is the introduction sequence. The original PlayStation game features 3 gorgeous pre-rendered CGI sequences strategically placed throughout the game. For the remake, the developers instead opted to render each of these scenes in real time, like Klonoa 2. This means recreating those original scenes using the game engine, and while I do think something is lost in the translation, it feels better integrated into the gameplay. And once you're handed control, the difference in fidelity becomes immediately obvious, but I dare say in this instance, the game is equally beautiful on both platforms. The Wii release is simply a new take on those original concepts. It's no small task either. The PlayStation game relies heavily on simplified shapes to create the illusion of a detailed world while keeping that polygon budget in check. This opens the door to more artistic interpretation in rebuilding the game. There isn't anything that can be reused on the Wii, so the designers had to create something entirely new, using the PS1 game as an inspiration. Structures are now much more detailed. The distant background uses a shallow depth of field effect, lending it an almost tilt-shift-like aesthetic. Backgrounds also extend further into the distance, increasing the sense of scale in the process. Here's a fun fact: the reflections visible across bodies of water in this game are rendered using the old-school method involving the placement of flipped geometry beneath the water plane. From above, it looks like distorted reflections, but in reality, it's just additional polygons. Another neat feature? We're standing on this multi-tiered wooden platform, but if you look closely, there's visible shadows present on the Wii. But these shadows are not projected in real time and are instead baked into the art, yet it's surprisingly effective in motion, I think. Arriving in the second stage, that original game relies heavily on a mix of vertex-painted lighting and textures designed to simulate sparkling crystals. This is somewhat retained on the Wii, and the overall color scheme is very similar. The TEV is used again to create the specular reflection effect across the background, which looks pretty good, I think. You should have also noticed that all objects in the game are now fully 3D on Wii. Enemies, main characters, collectibles, all modeled out, again, like Klonoa 2. Even with the additional geometry, the Wii version does not need to rely on distance fog to limit the amount of detail drawn in a scene, lending the stage a slightly enhanced sense of scale. Further in, we're back outside, and you might notice a scrolling cloud texture layer is applied to the environment, designed to create the illusion of clouds filling the skies above. The brief rain shower on PlayStation does not seem to trigger in the remake, however. Then we arrive at the first boss battle. Cutscenes all feature completely reworked camera angles, and the boss arena itself has lost its grassy covering in favor of modeled stonework. The bell is now more rounded, and features a reflection map applied to its surface, but it mostly plays the same. I love this cave entry. The artistry so confidently displayed here, both in terms of camera work and lighting, cannot be understated, but for a fun bonus, check out those waterfalls behind Klonoa here. You can see the previous area through the water, suggesting that you're platforming alongside the opposite side of the wall that you have previously traversed. So how does this actually work? Well, if we zoom in, just as the camera passes the point of the waterfall, you'll see that the artists have carefully modeled and placed lower resolution structures, representing the outdoor areas, against a textured background. From within the stage itself, it's a convincing effect, don't you think? And there's similar design decisions made in the next stage as well. On PlayStation, only the foreground is drawn using 3D graphics, but the Wii version seems to stretch out further into the distance. Thanks to the depth of field, It feels rich in detail, but if we actually stop and look closely, you'll see that the developers have placed a layer of modeled tree trunks first, followed by simple flat textures of tree trunks situated against a flat bitmapped layer. Now, not every effect has been pulled off quite so successfully. In one of the game's later stages, you might recall my remark on the beautiful particles generated by Klonoa as he dashes across the surface. Over on the Wii, however, no equivalent effect has been implemented. Too bad. Overall, while the Wii version is perhaps not quite as special as that 1997 original, it's still a fantastic and robust remake in its own right. It looks beautiful, sounds great, and plays like a dream with support for a wide range of controllers. Plus, it features a lot of extra bonus material. If they had managed to include the PS1 original in there as a bonus, however unlikely, it would have been a near perfect release. Unfortunately, this remake of Klonoa for Nintendo Wii nearly killed the series entirely. It simply failed to find an audience this time, selling precious few copies in the process. For all intents and purposes, this was the end. At least that's how it felt. That is until 2019, when Namco filed a trademark for Kaze no Klonoa Encore. This was followed by further trademark filings a couple years later, sparking some hope for fans of the series. And then, at last, in February 2022, during a Nintendo Direct, Klonoa made his triumphant return. This is Klonoa Phantasy Reverie series, also known as Kaze no Klonoa Encore in Japan. A complete remake of Klonoa 1 and 2 for modern platforms. Developed by Monkeycraft, the same team behind two other recent remakes, Katamari Damacy Reroll and Wonder Boy, Asha in Monster World, Phantasy Reverie series has been completely rebuilt using the Unity engine with new assets, visual changes, and other tweaks on the way. This is now the most affordable way to enjoy Klonoa, and at a glance the results are very good, but of course I wanted to dig a little deeper. Before we get into the comparisons with older versions, however, let's start with a little Digital Foundry basics, shall we? When it comes to playing Phantasy Reverie, for the first time in Klonoa history, you actually have a choice from multiple platforms. Here's what I can tell you. If you're playing on PS5 or Xbox Series X, you're going to get native 4K and it's going to run great. It also runs very well on Series S and the PC. But if you're limited to prior generation consoles, things get a little more tricky with less stable performance than the older systems. It runs well on every single last generation PlayStation and Xbox console, mostly delivering 60 frames per second. We're looking at the base PlayStation 4 version here, and yeah, it drops frames here and there, but by and large, it's very, very stable, which is exactly what you want from Klonoa. But there is one minor issue. The loading times between doorways are longer than any other version of Klonoa, and this applies to all the hard drive-based last generation consoles. But the real tragedy here is the Switch version, which struggles to run well, mostly hanging below the target 60 frames per second update. It's one black mark on an otherwise compelling package. A real shame though, as the Switch version could have been the premier release and really brought fans into the fold, but unfortunately it's just not good enough. That said, if you have access to one of the other platforms, you should definitely play this. I mean, if you've made it this far into the video and haven't played these games, this is easily the most accessible way to experience them today. Next, let's talk about the changes which apply to both games. So when you start a new game, you're given the option to select an easier difficulty if you prefer. You can take more hits and your win bullet travels further. I recommend the normal mode, but it's nice to have the option. Once you begin playing, you may notice something. The game now pauses every few steps to explain how to play. It's a 2-button action game. It doesn't require this level of explanation. The game attempts to walk first-time players through every possible encounter in a way that feels entirely misguided. If you do need guidance, the Wii version already solved this by placing optional signposts along the path. If you needed help, you had the option to read the signs, but it never seized control away from you like these bothersome tutorial windows. By the time you reach the first doorway, the game will have interrupted you 7 different times with multiple screens of tutorials. Thankfully, if you pop into the options menu, this feature can be disabled, and I recommend doing that right away. While we're in here though, you may also notice the optional pixel filter as it's called, and it's interesting as it does accurately replicate the look of a 320 by 240 pixel game, and even reduces the color depth resulting in visible banding. But it's not like it makes the game look like a PlayStation 1 game either, so it's kind of a strange feature. Phantasy Reverie also retains the original fictional language spoken in both games, with no option for the English or Japanese dubs created for the Wii version. In fact, with Klonoa 1, they reverted back to the PlayStation version's lower quality audio, which does make sense when you realize that the modified script in the Wii version has been removed as well, so I'm okay with this decision.
Right here.
My biggest gripe with the new version, however, are these loading screens. Once again, the developers felt the need to cram tips and animated loading icons in places where I feel they just don't belong. In the PS1 original, between stages, the game saves to your memory card and then immediately you're loaded into the next stage without any loading screens. You walk through a door, it fades to black with a fancy animation, and then bam, you're there. It's seamless. In the new game, that's no longer the case. On last-gen consoles, I can understand the need for an icon as the loading times are regrettably longer, but on PS5 or the Xbox Series consoles, I feel this feature should have been eliminated in favor of a brief black screen. It just feels kinda sloppy when the loading icon appears for such a short period of time. The way the story is told also feels less elegant. The development team felt that users should be aware that it is in fact possible to both fast forward through every cutscene or skip them entirely if they so desire, and then display the associated text and button prompts on every single dialogue box throughout the game. Somehow having these buttons visible all the time robs the game of some of its narrative charm, almost as if the developers have decided that these scenes really aren't important enough, so why not just use the fast forward feature. The more elegant solution here would involve displaying these prompts only if the player tapped a button, then fade them out again if the appropriate button is not pressed within a few seconds. Now, this collection includes both Klonoa 1 and 2, but the way in which they've been brought to life differs. Klonoa 1 is based on the Wii version with some enhanced textures and replaced character models, but for Klonoa 2, the team remade all of the assets from scratch, making it a true remake. So let's begin with the first game. There's no real reason to linger on comparisons with the PlayStation original. The differences are much in line with the Wii version, so you kind of already know what to expect there. The main thing I can say here is that the new version brings the color back, so it does look rather vibrant, even more so than the PS1 original in some ways. Where it gets interesting though is when we bring that Wii version into the mix. The first thing you'll notice is the change in character models. The Wii redesigns have been replaced with new models more in line with the original 1997 game. Klonoa is now shorter, wearing his giant red collar, while his jaundice-ravaged yellow eyes make a full return. Hupo's hands in Halo have also mercifully been returned. I like these changes, but I have one small nitpick. The animation seems to have been derived directly from the Wii version, and as a result, it doesn't fully match the new skeleton used for Klonoa. Wii Klonoa wasn't wearing the giant collar, so in this new version, this same oversized collar often clips through his arms and face. It's a little awkward, but thankfully only something you'll notice during these scenes. Now once we're in the game, you'll notice the new version features a much brighter, bolder appearance. The Wii version appears somewhat muted in comparison, while Phantasy Reverie goes hard on those primary colors we all love so much. The vibrant blue skies are especially attractive. They almost feel Saga-like. The only caveat here is that Phantasy Reverie now uses a bloom filter that can only be disabled in the PC version. When translating this game to new consoles, however, the developers have access to vastly more memory than on Wii. So what did they do with all this newfound memory? They created an entirely new set of high-resolution textures, that's what. The environments largely rely on Wii geometry data, but these new textures really freshen things up for that beautiful high-resolution output. Everything is sharper, more detailed and defined. It looks great overall, but not every scene feels like an improvement. In fact, the new version is lacking a number of key visual features. The depth of field is toned way down, or in the case of the Switch version, completely disabled. The cloud shadows are much less visible, though still present, and the water, to my eyes at least, is less visually striking, especially evident in areas featuring waterfalls. The lack of depth of field in particular becomes an issue in certain stages like this, where the lack of background detail becomes a lot more visible as a result of the increased clarity. On a more positive note, the new version of Klonoa features real-time dynamic shadows on moving entities, which looks pretty great in motion, I have to say. Overall though, I would argue that this version is an improvement over the Wii game. It's not perfect, but the strong colors, improved clarity, and the return of classic Klonoa are all welcome. I'm generally very happy with this one. Klonoa 2, on the other hand, is more of a mixed bag, and as we'll see in this next section, some areas look noticeably better, while others fall woefully short. Before we even start the game, I already have a nitpick, however. If you remember, on PlayStation 2, Klonoa 2 supported Dolby Digital 5.1 surround sound playback in certain scenes. Now you'd think that modern platforms, which are natively capable of real-time surround sound decoding, would feature this as well, but no, the Dolby Digital soundtrack is not present in this version, and in fact, the games are limited to just stereo output. So not only is the audio not enhanced, it's also worse than the original version. But alright, what about the visuals? The opening scene immediately highlights one of the biggest changes. The Klonoa filter, or cell shading, has been removed. I'm okay with this given the rest of the changes, but it took a little while to get used to. What I'm not okay with is the new version of Sea of Tears, the first stage. There's two big issues here. Firstly, the water. The beautiful ocean featured on PlayStation 2 gives way to this flat, less animated facade. I'm not a fan of this change at all. I feel like that original water effect could have been recreated in a shader, but they went for an entirely different style instead, and I don't really like it. Worse still, the PlayStation 2 particle shower has been replaced with a far less effective solution. The density of rain particles is reduced to a mere trickle, losing much of the ambience of this stage in the process. It's supposed to be stormy seas, but it no longer feels that way. Plus, the sky's color tone has changed a little too dramatically for my liking. The eerie, stormy yellow is completely erased. The characters, on the other hand, are generally much more geometrically dense, having been fully remodeled, and they do look pretty good. The environment itself is handsomely remodeled as well. Changes to lighting, effects, and water do detract from the overall look, but it's still suitably Klonoa 2, I'd say. Moving ahead, here's our first look at an interior section. The color scheme differs significantly, and the reliance on bloom is a little on the heavy side, but I appreciate the more nuanced geometry and higher resolution textures. Plus, they've included a water caustics texture along the ceiling, which looks great. Alas, once back out in the rain, I just can't help but feel the remake falls short in this stage. This scene is so perfectly designed on PlayStation 2, the light piercing through the clouds just above the statue, the torrential rain and powerful waves smashing against the rocks. It's just missing something in this new version. It doesn't feel right. Needless to say, based on this first stage, I was concerned that Monkey Craft had botched Klonoa 2, but thankfully this feeling does not last, and many of the other stages going forward look comparatively fantastic. So let's jump to La La Kusha then, the next platforming stage. This is one of my favorites in the game, and I was thrilled with this new iteration. While the color tone differs, it's still very much in the same ballpark. It looks and feels right. The inclusion of real-time shadows lends extra depth to the environments, while the bloom filter manages to look great in this instance as well. Texture quality is hugely boosted across the board, but some scenes do look a little off, like this big jump here. The PS2 version uses faked shadows baked into the scene at the distance to create a proper sense of scale. The remake lacks this completely. It does, however, feature expanded geometry in the same area, but it doesn't quite feel the same. In another scene, the designers modified these wind vents designed to launch Klonoa into the air. In their original form, leaf particles are used to convey the movement of air, while the remake leans on streams of wind instead. So while this stage doesn't nail every aspect, I do think it's a successful translation of the original mood intended by the developers. The next scene then gives us a closer look at the characters. How do you feel about the removal of the Klonoa filter when seeing them up close? I could take it or leave it, I suppose. And how about this boss fight? Fulguran, the armor beast, casts shadows in this remake thanks to the new lighting model, and the sequence plays and looks great. A suitable upgrade, I'd say. But okay, let's get serious here and check out the jungle slider. This is one of those stages I kinda go back and forth on. There are aspects I prefer in the PS2 original. The contrast between the wooden structure and the deep blue water is certainly eye-catching, but the gentle rippling in the remake is certainly no slouch either. Real-time shadows once again pull their weight, while increased levels of geometry flesh out what we could once only imagine. I do have one nitpick, however. Later in this stage, while surfing below the jungle canopy, the designers attempt to simulate light filtering across the characters from the trees above. Look closely at Klonoa and the enemies in this scene and you kinda see what I mean. If we compare it with the remake, however, everything appears overly bright, completely missing this effect in the process. It kinda looks flat in comparison. The final section then features vastly more geometry in the distance versus PlayStation 2, which relies on a textured dome. At the same time, this is an instance where I kinda prefer the color tone of the original. It doesn't quite tantalize the senses to the same degree in this remake. This should give you a rough idea of how the remake stacks up. Changes of this magnitude persist throughout the game. Increased model detail, higher resolution textures, and real-time shadows contrast against stylistic changes, which can feel a little hit or miss at times. Overall though, the team has done a great job at translating Klonoa 2 to modern platforms, though I feel Klonoa 1 is a little closer to that original vision. Also worth a mention, while the voice acting and dialogue is mostly identical, the script has actually been touched up, so it doesn't read identically to that original PS2 localization. I do feel like perhaps I've been a little overly critical of this package, but this is born more out of love than anything else. And in reality, it's a very well executed collection. There are definitely areas which could be improved. The Switch version is nowhere near what it should be, and all the loading screens and tips kinda get on my nerves, but it's definitely a game you need to check out. And the Phantasy Reverie series is a great way to do so. So where does Klonoa even go from this point? It's difficult to say. If Phantasy Reverie series finds enough of an audience, perhaps we'll finally receive a third console installment, though at the same time, who would even make such a game, and would it live up to the classics? It's difficult to say. What I can say, however, is that having replayed every game in the series over these past few weeks, my admiration for the series, which was already high by the way, has only increased. At the beginning of the video, I mentioned the 4 pillars of great platforming, and I hope by this point you've developed a better appreciation of why I feel Klonoa satisfies each of these points. But it's not just the gameplay. There's an emotional component. The designers at Namco have managed to produce something that can fill you with joy one moment, while pulling your heartstrings the next. To leave such an impact on players, even decades after its release, is the true mark of a classic. One thing is for certain, however, Klonoa is a dream I'll never truly forget.